A lot of those Russian military commanders who were selling their gear out of the back of a truck ever actually expected to have another war in Europe. They weren't actually prepared for these wartime scenarios. They just thought they had a fat gig where they could sell off their gear and sell out their homeland, and now it's come back to bite them in the ass. Vladimir Putin, 2022 Loser of the Year. My goodness, what an article headline. I was actually saving to read this on stream and give you guys my reaction, because the headline was so provocative to me, was so grabbing to me specifically, that I knew I had to read this. Guys are saying, is this a tabloid? No, this is not a tabloid. The Atlantic Council has a lot of weight in the American foreign policy community. They publish essays and commentary on foreign policy a lot. They're very, very much respected. They're respected amongst the American foreign policy establishment as well. So this is like, this is pretty fucking funny. I gotta be honest. Let's read the article. For the first time since the event was launched a decade ago, Vladimir Putin will not hold his flagship end-of-the-year press marathon this month. The surprise cancellation is the latest indication that not all is well in the Kremlin. For the past 10 years, I actually didn't heard of this. This is actually big. It is true. He does this at the end of every year. He has like the press come out and they like ask him questions, and he looks tough and like he's, he talks to the people directly. But he's canceled it when the journalists have the most questions ever of the entirety of his administration. It's because he's scared. He's running from the press. For the past 10 years, Putin's annual press marathon has been carefully curated propaganda spectacle, allowing the Russian dictator to demonstrate his mastery of world affairs. However, with his invasion of Ukraine unraveling amid unprecedented losses and mounting military defeats, Putin is clearly in no mood to face even the most docile of audiences. While Putin hides from cameras, his arch rival is ending the year on a wave of international acclaim. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has already been named Person of the Year by an ever-expanding list of media outlets, including Time Magazine and the Financial Times newspaper, and is now being routinely touted as one of the world's most influential politicians. Zelensky's rising profile is recognition of his wartime leadership and also reflects global admiration for Ukraine's courageous resistance to the Russian invasion. Unironically, you want to know what this is the Atlantic Council doing? The Atlantic Council could have just explained the first two paragraphs of this article by having like Chad Zelensky, Virgin Vladimir Putin, Beta Vladimir Putin, like the Chad and Beta meme. That's all they needed. Like that's all that paragraph was, if I'm being completely honest. The contrasting fortunes of the Russian and Ukrainian leaders underlined the self-defeating folly of Putin's decision to launch Europe's biggest conflict since World War II. His original plan envisaged a short and victorious war that would extinguish Ukrainian independence and force the country permanently back into the Kremlin's orbit. Instead, he now finds himself an international pariah, with his country's reputation as a military superpower in tatters and his Ukrainian enemies looking forward with growing confidence to the very real prospect of historic victory in the coming year. By almost every measure, Vladimir Putin is comfortably the biggest loser of 2022. This feels like a YouTube video. This feels like a funny YouTube video, not an Atlantic Council blog post. Oh my god. I still can't get over the fact the Atlantic Council posted this. Putin's woes can be traced. By the way, would you guys agree? Like gutter chat and site chat. The question: would you guys agree that Vladimir Putin is the biggest loser out of 2022? I think a close second would be that guy in Peru who attempted that coup and it just immediately face planted. I think he would also be a big loser. Probably also Liz Truss. I think Liz Truss would also be on this list. She's a big loser in 2022. She had the shortest premiership in the UK's history. She has to be one of the big losers as well. Yes, who else? I think these people are up there, but Vladimir Putin is like the person of the most prominence who I think is this big of a loser and has like undercut so much work overall. Like the amount of damage done to Russia compared to the amount of damage Liz Truss did to the UK, it's just not even comparable. It's just not even comparable. So I do think he would be rightfully voted this year's biggest loser. Well, actually, if you wanted to be meta about it, I would say Russia is the world's biggest loser, because at least Putin's still wealthy, gets to eat well, and everything's fine. Russians, on the other hand, yikesy, wikesy, no, man, oof, my goodness. All of this and for nothing. At least if you ask the Ukrainians while they're suffering, they're going to say, for the future of our freedom, you know, our independence, our sovereignty, democracy. If you ask Russians, it's going to be like imaginary Ukrainian forces coming to take Moscow and burn it to the ground with their gay Nazi trans Jew army. Putin's woes can be traced directly to the battlefields of Ukraine. His invading army has performed disastrously. Disastrously. That is how you say it? Oh my goodness. Okay. Over the past 10 months, and has lost a series of key engagement, including the Battle of Kiev, the Battle for Kharkiv, and the Battle for Kherson. And it's, by the way, this right now is like, they're kind of limiting it. You could also not only say the Battle for Kiev and the Battle for Kharkiv and the Battle for Kherson, but if you wanted to get into the niche details of the Battle of Kharkiv, you could talk about how not only did they win the Battle for Kharkiv, but they won the counteroffensive to retake Kupiansk. Not only did they win these battles, but they recently retook Lyman and are on the path to retaking Satovi, and which is the first step to retaking Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, which was a high-profile battle earlier in this war, right? And this isn't even talking about the blowing up of the Kerch Bridge or the or the strikes deep behind Russian territory on their bases. This isn't talking about the disastrous offensives that have failed for Russia, or any of the specific Ukrainian like military victories and all the ammo depots being blown up. There's like a lot of details you can get into to just see how disastrous this war has been in for Russia outside of just the big battles they fought. More than 100, oh, actually they're going to go on to explain it. More than 100,000 Russian soldiers are believed to have been killed or wounded. This is a high estimate. I think probably they're exaggerating a bit, but I think like 80,000 to 100,000, that range is the realistic range. But I lean more towards the 80,000 range. While thousands of Russian tanks and armored vehicles have been captured or destroyed, a really good resource for this is open source intel. If you don't believe it, or you're like let's say you're a Russian supporter that watches me for whatever reason, just go look at the open source intel on how many of these vehicles have been confirmed to be destroyed. Like, you don't even need to believe Ukrainian government sources on this. Even though not every vehicle destroyed has been documented with a photograph, some of them are destroyed and no photos were ever taken. But just from the ones that we have seen, like, it's already in the thousands. These losses have forced Putin to launch his country's first mobilization since 1945, a move that has destabilized Russia and brought the war home to previously supportive domestic audiences. Not to mention, it's not just that this is the first mobilization since 1945 and it's bad for Russians and Russians don't like it, but it also hasn't had a massive effect. I mean, it has had some effect, but it was botched. The mobilization was not supposed to go like this. The mobilization was supposed to go much better. It wasn't supposed to have all these guns recovered and we find out they're all rusty and dilapidated. It wasn't supposed to see T-62s being used in higher and higher amounts with a million different engineering problems, as these are old as fuck Cold War 1960s tanks. We weren't supposed to see all of these soldiers being sent out with no winter gear because 1.5 million winter uniforms disappeared because the Russian army is incredibly corrupt. Huge surprise, and nobody fully accounted for how unbelievably corrupt the Russian military was going to be, because I don't think a lot of those Russian military commanders who were selling their gear out of the back of a truck ever actually expected to have another war in Europe. They weren't actually prepared for these wartime scenarios. They just thought they had a fat gig where they could sell off their gear and sell out their homeland, and now it's come back to bite them in the ass. That was something that American intelligence did not account for during the start of this war, and so we underestimated how piss poor the performance of the Russian soldiers would be. That's on top of the fact that these soldiers aren't just like, I mean, it's gotten so bad that everyday Russians are crowdfunding to pay for Russian medical gear. Now, I understand if Russia was invaded and they were the one crowdfunding, then I'd be like, okay, I understand, because they weren't prepared. But they were the ones who set out on this war. They were the ones who set out on this misadventure, and they're the ones not prepared. It would be like if I swung at somebody to start a fight, and then you immediately find out, then I have no idea how to fight. Then why did you throw a punch if you have no idea how to fight? And it was because the Russians underestimated the Ukrainians. They underestimated their will to fight. They underestimated the amount of corruption they had. They overestimated themselves. And they underestimated how much the Ukrainian military had improved during the Poroshenko and Zelensky administrations over the last 8 years, and got more in line with NATO standards, which have largely been designed to fight Russia. It isn't surprising that the more and more Ukraine got in line with NATO standards and continued to train and build themselves up, by the way, they're better at fighting Russia when they're using the tactics specifically designed for a potential war with Russia. The Russians, prepared for a war that was supposed to last a week, and now we're going on 300 days. 300 days of violence and bloody war that the Russians not at all thought they were going to be signing up for. They honestly thought they were only going to need rations for like 4 days. They ran out of food, they ran out of gas, and all the offensive stalled. And we've been here ever since. Russia's international image has been badly tarnished by revelations of war crimes committed against Ukrainian civilian populations. Russian troops stand accused of carrying out mass executions and engaging in sexual violence, abductions, and torture throughout occupied Ukraine. I've spoken to people who have testified to me personally, on top of all the footage that already exists, about friends and family being executed, and rape, and abduction, and mass deportations of children. In Kherson, Ukrainians actually had to hide orphans in the homes of those who ran the orphanages because the Russians wanted to deport them. They wanted to grab them and deport them to Moscow, away from their native homeland. I mean, that's when you start getting into questions of actual genocide. In fact, the New Lines report, the New Lines Institute wrote a report about this in April, that even now, like 10 months after the war has started, seems to still be ringing true about the risk of genocide. Actually, we're reading the Atlantic Council. I think they also put out an article about genocide in Ukraine, and how the mass deportation of children is something that does bring up that question. Millions of Ukrainians have been subjected to forced deportation, while policies of indiscriminate bombardment have left tens of thousands of dead and reduced dozens of Ukrainian towns and cities to rubble. I have been out east into the Donbass. This is the Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine that, are supposed to be the parts of Ukraine that Russia's quote-unquote liberating. And I see these houses, some of them literally made of mud plaster and straw, just completely torn apart. Nothing left because of Russian missiles. There was no military bases near it. There was no military positions near it. It was indiscriminate bombing. I have posted footage, and you have seen it on my YouTube channel and on Twitter, of me in Mykolaiv as the Russians peppered the city center, not aiming for any individual military target, but killing Ukrainian civilians and injuring them in indiscriminate bombing campaigns because they're panicking and they don't know what to do, and they're taking out their frustrations on the Ukrainian civilian population. You combine the dehumanization that Russian media pumps regularly, that we've covered on this channel constantly. You can go check out my second channel, DylanBurnsLIVE, where I've posted a lot of this footage. We've watched this on any of the VODs. I mean, you can go back on my Twitch VODs and see me talking about this. The dehumanization of Ukrainians, you combine that with military failures and hungry soldiers who aren't getting fed good food, and gas shortages, fuel shortages, a bunch of battlefield losses, and half your division getting ambushed and torn apart. It isn't too surprising that the Russians have resorted to such brutal tactics when they're looking at Ukrainians as almost subhumans. And they're just denying their very existence. Dmitry Medvedev said, the former leader of Russia, right-hand man of Putin, that Ukraineness is a disease of the mind. I mean, the Russians are very open on state television, and even to international observers, that they are conducting a terror campaign using Iranian-supplied drones, cruise missiles, and missiles against Ukrainian infrastructure. In recent months, Russia has begun the methodological destruction of Ukrainian civilian infrastructure with the expressed intention of depriving Ukrainians of the access to heating, electricity, and water during the depths of winter. Many international observers see these policies as nothing short of genocide, especially as they've been accompanied by a steady stream of openly genocidal rhetoric from regime propagandists and Kremlin officials in Moscow. Others have been appalled by Putin's readiness to engage in nuclear saber-rattling. On multiple occasions, the Russian leader has issued thinly veiled threats alluding to the possible use of the country's vast atomic arsenal. This blackmail has provoked a strong backlash, with U.S. officials promising catastrophic consequences, and even the normally supportive Chinese rebuking Russia. We read an article on the channel recently about the secret negotiations that took place between the United States government and the Chinese government. And remember earlier in this war, when the Polish offered to take their MiG fighter jets and send it to Ukraine? Well, because America agreed not to send the F-16s to Poland so they could send the 33 MiGs to Ukraine, and because of us not agreeing so far, I think, not to send the longer range missiles, China agreed to not only not sell weapons to Russia for them to use in this war, and to try to stop Russia from buying back weapons from nations they've already sold their weapons to use in this war. But they also agreed to talk to Russian generals and tell them, generals that they've made contacts with through military drills with Russia, to tell them, in a scenario where Vladimir Putin gives the order to launch nukes, don't follow his orders. That isn't just China not being supportive of Vladimir Putin. That is China specifically trying to put guardrails in place to account for Vladimir Putin if he goes completely off the rails. Many international observers see... Wait, I already read this. Oh, okay. I can't scroll down on this page anymore. Google has decided that I have read enough. Okay, now I can scroll. All of this has left Russia more internationally isolated than at any time since the immediate aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution a century ago. In a revealing recent exchange, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov admitted, "Nobody likes us, and they don't intend to start liking us." Peskov may have had the Western world primarily in mind, but his comment also reflected the wider realities of Russia's increasingly unfavorable international position. Moscow's isolation is most immediately obvious at the United Nations, where a series of General Assembly votes condemning the invasion of Ukraine have passed with resounding majorities. Tellingly, only a handful of pariahs, such as North Korea and Syria, have been prepared to stand with Russia. Closer to home, the Kremlin is visibly losing influence throughout the former Soviet Empire. In Central Asia, Kazakhstan is openly distancing itself from Russia while strengthening ties with China, Turkey, and the West. In the South Caucasus, Azerbaijan is increasingly ignoring Russia's nominal role as a regional peacekeeper, while Armenia, I was going to bring this up, Armenia bristles over Moscow's failure, this is a real failure, to provide any meaningful protection. Dude, there was actually a point where FSB agents in Armenia were bombed by the Azerbaijani military. That's how low the Kremlin's reputation has gotten. Even and we're not even talking about like what the populations of this alliance think. Kazakhstan, former Soviet state, a close relationship with Moscow. It has many Russian speakers in it. Russia, like people from Russia will go to Kazakhstan with like Z stuff on their cars, and locals will scratch it off their cars. They'll yell at them like, "How dare you come to my country supporting the murder of our brothers in Ukraine?" Like they flip out. And the Kazakh government has changed their rhetoric around the war to be more critical, explicitly saying they don't support the invasion, specifically because they know their civilian population stands against the brutalization of their brothers in Ukraine. Even the Belarusian dictator, Alexander Lukashenko, who depends almost completely on the Kremlin for his political survival, has so far managed to resist Russian pressure to directly participate in the invasion of Ukraine. On the wider international stage, the United States has succeeded in consolidating Western support for Ukraine. Meanwhile, Putin's efforts to weaponize energy exports have backfired and forced European countries to turn decisively away from reliance on Russia. BRICS nations, Brazil, India, China, and South Africa, continue to purchase Russian resources, but are now doing so of their own heavily discounted terms. Beyond this pragmatic trade, they have refused to back Russia or provide Moscow with much-needed weapons. This has forced the Kremlin to seek replacement tanks, artillery shells, drones, and missiles from the likes of Iran and Belarus. What can Putin look forward to in 2023? He appears to believe the international alliance opposing his invasion may still eventually lose interest and is pinning his hopes on Western leaders forcing Kiev into some kind of compromise deal that will allow Russia to snatch a victory of sorts from the jaws of defeat. However, with most of Ukraine's backers publicly stating they will let the Ukrainians themselves decide when to negotiate, this outcome looks unlikely. After all, no Ukrainian government could conceivably condemn millions of their own compatriots to the horrors of indefinite Russian occupation. A far more realistic scenario would see the well-armed and highly motivated Ukrainian military continue to steadily liberate occupied territory, or Russia suffer heavy losses among poorly trained and badly equipped conscript troops. This is a recipe for disaster for the Putin regime. The Russian army in Ukraine is already deeply demoralized and struggling to mount localized offensives. Further, dude, every day while I'm in here and doing these streams, I have somebody come into my gutter chat, also known as my Twitch chat, and say, Bakhmut's gonna fall today, or Bakhmut's falling. And they've been saying that for over a month now. For over a month, I've been being told, oh, Bakhmut's fall is around the corner. It's around the corner because it's the one thing the Russians are like consistently still attacking, but they're failing to attack it with massive casualties, with the Wagner group taking the lead in the offensive on Bakhmut. And you want to know, like every day I hear somebody say that, and it doesn't happen, my confidence in the Ukrainian defense continues to improve. And I'm not saying that the Russians one day might not take Bakhmut. But Bakhmut is not that strategic. Number one, it's not even that strategically important. It's just one of the steps to taking back Kramatorsk, which is the last big city that the Russians would want to take in Donetsk. And the amount of casualties they've taken to try to take Bakhmut are absolutely massive, and they're only going to continue to take more. The Ukrainians also are taking massive casualties, but the Russians just have less bodies. A far more realistic, and they have less well-trained bodies. A far more realistic, I already read that. The Russian army in Ukraine is already deeply demoralized and struggling to mount localized offensives. Further attrition in the coming months will raise the prospect of a more comprehensive military collapse that could have grave consequences for the future of the Russian Federation itself. As 2022 draws to a close, it is already obvious that Putin's fateful decision to invade Ukraine was one of the biggest geopolitical blunders of the modern era. His dreams of shattering the post-1991 settlement and rebuilding the Russian Empire has made him the single greatest threat to global security and placed him in direct confrontation with a formidable coalition of the world's most powerful nations who have reluctantly come to recognize the necessity of his defeat. Putin enters 2023 with few friends and fewer options. The coming year is shaping up to be the darkest of his entire reign. It may also be his last. Damn! I mean, this is the Atlantic Council, so the bias is a little obvious here, but the vast majority of the analysis here is on point. Like, I can't even, like, argue with the vast majority of analysis. I think at the end when they start saying, oh, it might be his last, and these global powers were reluctant to get on board, I don't think the United States was reluctant. I think other powers like Germany, much more reluctant. I don't think the United States was reluctant. And I don't necessarily think that 2023 may be his last. I think the odds of him being removed from power by protests or because of this war are pretty low, at least at the time being. That could change in the future, but generally, decent analysis. I would agree that Vladimir Putin is probably the biggest loser of 2022. Hopefully his replacement isn't that dumb. Let me be honest, guys, when people talk about like Vladimir Putin being removed, people like have this idea that he's going to be replaced by like Alexei Navalny and he's going to say, okay, everybody have back Crimea and like everything, but that's not the scenario. That's not what's going to happen most likely. He's probably going to be replaced with an oligarch or some military general or not somebody good. That is the most likely scenario. That doesn't mean it wouldn't be good if he lost power, but I'm just saying like this idea that then liberal democracy would come to Russia automatically is a little delusioned. If I'm being completely blunt, it is a little delusioned.